Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Euramerican National Assembly. I am your host, Mr. R, and with me today I have Mr. Ed, Mr. Black, and Don, our usual panel. Today we're going to be talking about culture, but really with a goal of talking about what is our culture and how do we promote and embrace that culture. And this is a really big topic, and there's a lot of sort of philosophical and kind of academic thought that goes into it. We're going to try not to hit that too hard. Obviously, we have to a certain extent. But the goal really is to talk about, what is our culture and how we as a community will embrace and promote that. And the thing with culture, it's required for a community. If a community doesn't have a culture, doesn't have its own culture, then it's not a community. It's not a distinct group, and it will fall apart. So there's this link between identity, community, culture, heritage is connected in here. There's a lot of very interconnected concepts and things that are important, and we're going to touch on a lot of that. But and the goal here is kind of looking forward, as a group, what are we trying to do? We're trying to promote and embrace our culture, and what's it going to take to do that? So without further ado, I guess I will go ahead and throw it to Mr. Ed, who has a few things kind of to start us off with.
Yeah, I've got like 10 pages of stuff. So, I mean, I want to emphasize one thing that I've seen in sociological, anthropological literature, and that is that a society and its culture are intertwined concepts. You cannot separate the two. Culture creates a society. Society maintains itself through culture. So if we want to maintain ourselves, it's going to happen through culture. I guess we could even start with some basic questions. What is culture? And again, I've picked a couple different sources for definitions. I'm going to start with the one that I like most. And I read it many years ago, and I've been looking for the original source, and I haven't been able to identify it. But to me, it speaks completely of what culture is and why it's important. And that definition is that a culture is a people's program of survival. It's the set of beliefs that they create to sustain themselves in a very complicated world. And so if we're going to survive, we're going to do it with our culture.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of an interplay of what you believe and what you do. Like, I've been thinking back to some of the early cultural anthropological stuff I've read about. You'll read about like corded ware culture. All we know about them is what they did in terms of the types of products that they made to ensure their own survival. And so there's this connection between, that they all had beliefs that were associated with this, but we don't know what they were. But yeah, so culture is beliefs, it's values, it's activities to a certain extent too.
So the way that anthropologists often distinguish it is culture and artifacts of culture. So culture is it's everything that you believe. And based upon what you believe, you do things in the world with it. So pottery is an artifact of that culture. And it's important because some people will look at a picture on a wall and go, wow, that's culture. It's like, well, there were ideas behind it that created that.
That you may or may not be able to extrapolate just by looking at the painting on the wall.
Right, exactly. And that's another aspect that I think is important about culture is most people have what are known as what I call authentic culture. They don't understand all of the underlying reasons and justifications and principles and foundations. They just express their culture and what they believe. And it's hard to dive into the deeper levels and say, well, what are the principles that define our culture?
Right. And, you see this all throughout the world. Even when you transplant a people from a place, they will often set up what they know to be their culture. That's why all throughout the West, when the West was being frontiered, you had Chinatowns pop up. And it wasn't Chinatown because they were segregated by anybody. It was Chinatown because that's where they wanted to gather to express the way they felt most comfortable living, and that was their culture. So you see these now historic towns that are part of bigger towns, and you see this happening a lot all throughout the United States with all these new groups that are coming in. You don't just see, they don't come here and assimilate and become Americans. They stay Pakistani and they have a Pakistani area. They stay Somali and they have a little Somalia. The Italians, you have a little Italy. In some places you have what they call Little Bavaria, because it was where German immigrants came, and they set up basically a German town in America. So you see that a lot happening. So you can't just separate a person and say that person now will give up that culture. It's who they are.
And I suppose that if you take the hypothetical example of, let's say, a Chinese person in Los Angeles who didn't grow up in Chinatown, and their parents sent them to the new public schools that were opening up. Sure, they might know English and they might have been around white people or Mexican people their whole lives. Still, they will feel affinity toward the people living in Chinatown, because those people, this is the genetic component of it, those people are tied to them as far back as tens of thousands of years.
Right, I've heard it referred to as a biospirit. When people, this is why you get a lot of these second and third generation people that may be in another country suddenly start reverting back to their homeland's ways, and it's that biospirit within each group.
And this gets to one of the reasons why we're talking about culture today, is that the understanding that people create culture and that people aren't just interchangeable cogs, that you can't just swap in one people for another people. This is something we've talked about with kind of the Marxist, push in America, and the cultural Marxism, and all of these things are basically trying to deny this basic reality that people create their own cultures and they carry them with them, and they don't just abandon them. They are part of who you are. So I think those are all good points.
Just focusing on again, just definitions. One Wikipedia source says, a culture is an umbrella term that encompasses the social behavior, institutions, and norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and habits of the individuals in these groups. I would point out, though, that the issue of group is significant. Another definition was that a culture is a set of customs, traditions, and values of a society or community, such as an ethnic group or nation. Cambridge English Dictionary says it's the way of life, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a particular time. But again, I want to emphasize that in many cases, people mix up the artifacts of culture from culture, and they'll say the institutions are the culture. Well, people express their behavior of group belongingness through these institutions, but it's the ideas that are embodied in them that I would argue, anyways.
But that's interesting, because I didn't really understand that distinction either. So kind of breaking that apart. I mean, I do think that the artifacts of culture are incredibly important for a culture and a people to survive. But obviously, you're right. Those are created by and driven by those beliefs and values that are kind of under the hood, right?
And even people don't even think about it, but things like technology. Technology is ideas, and that's culture. And yes, you can convey technological ideas across cultures, but if the particular culture rejects those ideas, then they don't have those technologies.
Right. Look at the Amish.
Right.
They basically made a decision. I think their technology basically stopped in the 1840s. That isn't to say that they won't hire people who have modern technology to get things done. They will do that, but they themselves won't interact with that modern technology.
Right. Well, and something interesting that I noticed, I think it was with the Wikipedia definition, is that they mentioned across a certain period of time, and immediately I just thought American culture in the 1990s. I don't know if you could apply that to historical cultures, especially as you go further back. Of course, they do change with time, but I would argue that the majority of a strong culture stays with that group of people for millennia even.
And one of the ways that happens is through literature. You know, for example, Confucianism. Sorry if I'm having trouble with that. But so somewhere along the line, somebody took the ideas about their culture and wrote it down. That's what, you know, Confucius thought is. And yes, because that's been codified, it can carry on for thousands of years. And we have similar ideas that are kind of unique to the Western approach of thinking that's very different than any other people's.
Right. You know, groups of people kind of show their culture through traditions. And a tradition cannot just be, you know, a national thing. It can be a family thing. And that's your family's culture. But it can still fit into the larger culture at hand. For instance, Thanksgiving is part of the American culture. There were civilizations that did similar things, but it was never really codified as this is our day as a nation to give thanks. You know, and we did that. So that's part of our traditional culture that on this day, we're going to get together as families, as groups, share a big meal, and be happy and thankful. And that's part of us expressing our culture. And other cultures have similar things, but not the same.
And it could definitely be argued that the expression of Thanksgiving is not necessarily about giving thanks for receiving fish from the natives or whatever, but more so that it was about what the ancestors were worshiping even before America. And that it does go further back spiritually, but it just so happens that in the American expression of it, it was more recent.
So, you know, I've put a lot of effort into studying and understanding culture. I took a lot of classes on it when I was in school. It's important to think about what culture is. And one of the first things that culture provides us is an identity. So culture answers, who are we? You know, what defines us? And, you know, each people have a certain set of unique beliefs that define who they are, where they've come from, how they're constructed, or what their goals and ideals are in life. You know, their culture talks about how they organize themselves, how they organize themselves to accomplish things, and some of that is technology. One important thing is who or what are our authorities, and how do we determine, are there processes to determine, you know, in many cases, you know, there is a process, and it's not necessarily that the leader established themselves as being a leader, but that, you know, there's a process which says if people vote for this person, then that person is our leader. So that's a kind of a cultural approach.
Well, this is kind of an interesting one, because one thing I was thinking about as I went into this discussion was there's a weird quirk of the sort of pro-white kind of community is that we're all countercultural compared to the mainstream sort of, you know, system, right? So we all have this, we're all kind of coming into culture having kind of bucked, well, I don't know if you would say that the anti-white sort of ideas in America are part of American culture now. I don't know if that's really accurate, but they are a thing that is suffusing America that we're all rejecting, right? So we're all starting this discussion as people that are bucking the mainstream of culture, and I just
the current narrative.
The current narrative, I guess. Is a narrative, is it really part of culture, or is that more of a temporary?
Well,
both.
And just to add quickly, I remember in a previous discussion, I mentioned the idea that the culture that normal everyday Americans are living through is really an anti-culture. It's designed to be the opposite of culture, but to fill that same space which was left empty by the destruction of, you know, what we would say is the original traditional American culture. And so in some ways we are rejecting a mainstream culture, but in some other ways we are rejecting a fake culture for a real one.
And part of the issue that you're bringing up specifically with regard to American identity and American culture is the role that the constitutional approach or the Republican approach a lot of authority was given to that whole process, defined and embodied in, quote unquote, the Constitution. And even to the point where, now it's just recognized if the U.S. government declares this person to be an American, they're an American. And it's like, no, we can reject their authority on that issue. In fact, I would argue we must, because it's thoroughly destructive if we don't put our own authorities within our own culture, within our own people. Then we've given that authority to someone else. And just because, like, let's say, oops, the Marxists got voted into government, so does that mean that they're authoritative and they can now declare for us what's right and wrong and who we are and such? No, we have to reject people who reject our culture and our ideals.
One might say that that's the founding element of American identity, of American culture, is rejecting something that doesn't fit with the individual that is American. So Marxism, or an extreme form of monarchism.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've been really studying a lot lately is the English Civil War, and there's a culture that came and originated through there that has continued. I would even argue that a lot of the people and their descendants who were involved in that war in Britain came to the United States, and they carried that culture forward, and even to the point where when other British come to America and they look at Americans and they go, I see nothing but a whole country of Tories. Tories are a particular kind of faction or cultural subgroup in the British culture. And that's what's expressed in American culture to a large extent. At some point, that under a monarchical system, the monarch is the authority. And everybody goes, okay, whatever the monarch says, that's what's right or wrong. Part of the rejection of the monarchy through the English Civil War and into the American system was, we have to create and define some new authority, and that authority became the Constitution. And I would argue also natural rights as a more larger principle. The Declaration of Independence is often looked at as, governments are created by men, for men, and whenever any government becomes harmful to that, then it is the right of the people to alter or abolish, blah, blah, blah.
Well, one thing, I guess, while we're talking about this in terms of authority and culture, something that I've been thinking about is in American sort of popular culture, it almost seems that popularity is of cultural artifacts actually drives authority. So, people put a huge amount of authority into the hands of popular celebrities, right? And what are they? They're cultural artifact creators. They make music or they make movies or whatever. It's a kind of a weird thing that there's this kind of media popularity contest that drives the decision of who has that authority. Is that kind of a good way to think about this?
Absolutely. I think, normally through the development of people, when people are children, their parents are seen as the authority. But as they become teenagers, they have to establish themselves and answer for themselves. Who am I and what's authoritative? And they start looking for authorities in their lives. And those authorities can become, the cliques that they belong to or whatever. And those can influence permanently who they see themselves as. And so popular culture is focused on that group because it can control and change and focus and force people in different directions. That's it. Popular culture, if we look at what's happened in the United States in particular, it has changed America from what it was, say, in the 50s. No media like the television, for example, existed prior that could influence and affect people in such a way.
And just to add to that, it is interesting how the American popular culture has snowballed from, what I was taught in history class was that it really began in the 1920s with, major commercialization and the last, so far, industrial revolution. People began listening to the radio, and eventually television came into the fold. And after that point, it seems that popular culture has become a beast unto itself, answers to no one. Although, I'm sure we could really dig in and figure out who it does answer to, but it's consumed the world. How American is popular culture?
Well, I do think that there is a certain amount of controlling or guiding of it that happens by people that are opposed to us and our interests, and we've kind of talked about that culture, that popular culture, cultural authority, it is used as a weapon. And maybe that's something we can get into later, is how much of that culture or those cultural artifacts can we embrace, can we enjoy, or how much should we be trying to push them out of our lives or out of our community, our culture? Obviously, we can talk more about that later, but I think that it's true that culture is used to, popular culture, cultural artifacts, music, and television has been used to change America dramatically. And that's something I think we've all thought about in terms of the need for our own media, our own entertainment, because it does affect people way more deeply than anyone wants to admit to themselves.
Right, and a big part that's kind of driven this new media culture is the fracturing of the American family. Like we talk about in the 1950s, you had a mom who stayed home. You had a dad who went and worked 9 to 5. He was home in the evenings. He was the authority in the house, in cooperation with his wife. They were who the kids looked up to. Now, mom's at work, dad's at work, going this way, that way, at school, the soccer practice. So now what they see as an authority is, well, there's a talking head on the TV that's telling me things. I like when they sing songs, so what they have to say about such things in the news or something must be relevant to the rest of my life.
I think we've talked about this before, or at least some of us personally. The music video for the Cyndi Lauper music video for Girls Just Want to Have Fun. This is like back in like the late 70s or maybe early 80s.
It was mid to late 80s.
Mid to late 80s, okay. But anyway, it's explicitly, shows the kids just, disobeying their parents and destroying things and being, being awful. And it's like that culture, or that pop culture, was enhancing destroying the family, and it almost seems cynical in that it gave more authority to the other, right? You got rid of the family, and now the pop icons actually have more influence. So I don't know. I'm not saying that like that was all orchestrated or anything, but it does feel like it all kind of at least fed on itself.
Well, and another thing a lot of people don't think about, and I kind of realized, was that, parents don't control the culture that is expressed in the schools, for example. So children are brought up in either a culture that's defined and created by the children themselves, or that, in some form or another is allowed to happen by the people in charge. And so the public schools has been a major mechanism for changing people's views, attitudes, what's authoritative. It just has been. And also one other thing, so yes, the mass media prior to the 20s was newspapers, and you had to be able to read to be able to be influenced by it. Then radio came along, and then in the 50s-ish, coming into the 60s, television started coming about. But one argument I would make is that, people go, oh, people could do anything they want. It's like, no. How did they control it? How did they control those media? And the answer was licensing. They licensed who could transmit and how much power they could. For example, if they reduced the transmittable power to certain stations, it would cover smaller areas, which would mean you would have more cultural aspects being expressed. But by controlling it and giving authority to ABC, CBS, NBC, the big three especially through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is how they controlled culture.
And it's really fascinating when you realize how much control they had when radio first came about and when TV first came about, because you realize that seems really antithetical to American culture, where you should be able to put any idea you want out there, so long as you're not threatening somebody else.
Well, and so the big difference that I saw came in the 90s with the internet, and the internet was completely uncontrolled, especially through the 90s coming into the 2000s.
Bad news. We got to shut it down.
It was a great opportunity to spread a pro-white message. It was the Wild West again for ideas, and it still is. They're having trouble controlling it, but they're doing their best. You know, they're putting in their fact checkers. What's a fact checker? It's an authority that determines how correct certain ideas are. They interfere. They don't allow ideas that they don't like to get expressed on YouTube or Twitter or whatever. So they're controlling culture by controlling ideas that the public is exposed to. So the solution is we have to control our own culture. We have to be responsible for producing and distributing and saying that our culture and our media are authoritative representatives of our culture.
And have meaning and value to
Right.
our people.
Yeah.
I will say that almost feels too big of a task, that it's because we're talked about all the different aspects of culture, all the different ways that culture is influenced and created and changed. And then I think about that and I say, okay, well, we have to control our own culture. Well, that means we have to, we have talked about this, though, that means a parallel society that has as much under its own, control as possible, as much sovereignty as you can possibly have. And that, comes all the way to, it comes from, you have music and entertainment and news, and it flows all the way down to people growing food, in the way that we approve of. And so there's a huge set of things there. But obviously, we're gonna bite off some chunks. Early on, there's some low-hanging fruit, and there's some most important targets, I would say. But yeah, the long-term goal is culture is society, and
If we don't own our own culture, we don't control our society.
exactly.
And you can look in history where there are multiple groups, multiple nations throughout the world that were an authority was openly trying to destroy them and their culture. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, you can look directly to them just in the past couple of decades. The USSR and the Soviet man was trying to destroy what they were, but they held on to their own cultures in their own homes as a community. A lot of times they couldn't express it even out in public. They would be arrested and sent to the gulag. But they could do so in their own homes with trusted friends. And they did. And today, those countries have cultural centers that now are very vibrant.
So actually, let's talk about that kind of that piece, because that's something that was in our outline. The different cultures in the past that survived those occupations. What was that occupation like? How did they survive it? And what are the parallels to our current situation, which we're kind of in a cultural occupation, if not a military occupation? But yeah, obviously you have the Baltic states. Ireland is another major example where they were
The Irish and the Scots.
the Irish and the Scots both. I guess the Welsh to
also.
a certain
The
extent.
Welsh.
Yeah, I'm not
Yep.
sure about. I don't know that much about that one. But so, how did those groups fare in terms of keeping their culture through that occupation? What worked and what didn't, and what lessons should we learn from that?
So one of the first that I know of is a culture of cynicism, for example. And that cynicism is directed towards the Soviets in particular. So there was always one kind of like an underlying kind of joke about the relationship between a people and the Soviet Union, for example. And if you study Russian culture, you'll see this kind of cynicism arise. And a lot of it actually exists even in the U.S. today. It's developed its own kind of cynical culture. But, the old joke is, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. That's the kind of cynicism that allowed them to survive. It rejected the authority of the Soviets and separated and isolated them.
In Soviet Union, joke tells you.
Exactly.
But what you do notice now in the case of Ireland, they did end up losing their language, and I'm sure with the Welsh case, in addition to Ireland, a huge chunk of their identity now is anti-English. But none of these cultures that still exist are solely based on their hatred for the former oppressor. If you go to Latvia and Lithuania, they still sing their songs that they've sung for 1,000 years, and
So-
they still have their language.
I've got some examples, being of Welsh background. My family is, on my mother's side, is Welsh, and yet they moved to London, and my aunt told me stories that when they would go camping in Wales, they're Welsh people, but they speak English. They'd be hiding inside of a tent, and the Welsh people would be outside. Get out of here, Londoners! Get out of here, British! So there was that kind of culture, and so I went over to England, in Great Britain, in the 70s, and there was hardly any public expression of Welsh culture. I went again in the 2000s, and ta-da! Suddenly there are Welsh television channels, and the Welsh language is being spoken.
They speak, just like in Ireland, they speak the language. They have the state actually broadcasts shows in their native language.
Absolutely.
Right. My one of my daughters is looking at colleges over in Ireland and in Wales. And she said that although they teach the classes in English, if you specialize, you're going to have to learn Gaelic. You're going to have to learn Welsh, or else you're not taking the class. They won't even admit you if you don't speak those languages. So those languages are making a huge resurgence. I think in the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s, where globalism was really spreading, they were trying to squash that. But it is making a return to people that, as long as the language still exists in known memory, obviously, there are languages that have died out because they were crushed.
And I lived in Canada in the 70s, and I was seeing, being both kind of British and French, I was seen as belonging to the French community. And some of my French friends are saying, "Hey, let's go burn down this bridge to keep the British out of our towns." So, whether you call that cynicism, hostility, it's necessary. The in-group preference and out-group isolation is the first step to sustaining a culture.
The acts of terrorism aren't necessary, but
Right?
the
but
expression in general, yeah.
yeah, no, I'm not. I agree. In fact, acts of terrorism are probably the last thing that you need. It is culture that must change. People must adopt and sustain their own culture in isolation, and that is by guarding their culture, guarding their values, and promoting and giving those things value in their lives.
Yeah, you talk about in-group preference, and that is part of culture. Nearly every culture in the world has an in-group preference, except when you come to America, because the way we were founded was everyone, this is the American dream, come and be part of it.
I would argue that's not true. Thomas Jefferson only wanted Americans to be Europeans.
That I would agree with, yeah. But he didn't make the distinction between Germans and, you can't be a Welshman, you can't be an Irishman, you can't be this. It was all of Europe can come here and be part of this grand experiment that is America. And that has now been subverted to be anybody in the world, even if they're not culturally compatible with the culture that was and still is America.
And I would argue that came through I would argue it started with World War II, established itself in the 50s, established it more in the 60s and then in the 70s, because I can remember when I went to school in the 60s, we were learning, quote unquote, Euramerican history. We were learning about the expansion of the European peoples across North America.
Manifest Destiny.
And then all the racial problems, the riots and such. And then in the 70s, suddenly we no longer have American history. We have social studies. And we suddenly anybody. So what happened was the government seized authority over who gets to be an American or not. I remember a foreign girl I was talking to one time, and she goes, I came to America and I didn't think that there were so many blacks in America or black Americans, because the term was, when she said Americans, I thought whites, and she meant blacks, and I was going, blacks aren't Americans, but nowadays that kind of thinking, that culture no longer is propagated and promoted.
Well, so I think we can agree that we're in the stage of we're at least a generation or two generations, I guess, into this kind of cultural suppression or cultural domination. And a lot of the historical examples that we pointed to, they went through a period where there wasn't, I mean, I think Gaelic almost died out, right?
Yep.
Yes.
And Welsh, almost died out.
Yes.
And language is obviously an easy thing to point to as a part of culture, but there's other aspects that I'm sure they did lose completely. But now they're pushing to recreate culture, sort of make their culture distinct again. I think that's kind of where we are too, in a lot of ways. That the Euramerican culture, the Euramerican identity, I have a hard time thinking about what my identity is, what my culture is. A lot of these things are, we've had a lot of this beaten out of us. And so we're kind of in this state that they were in. How did these other groups do it? I think the one that I know the best, the one that I read about the most, was Estonia. And this is what you're talking about, where they were rounding people up that were cultural activists who were literally just promoting, Sing Estonian Songs Day, and you would go to Siberia for that, right? Because they really didn't want that sort of thing to be maintained. But they did, they survived. I'm sure they lost some of their culture, and then they pushed back, right? They recreated their culture again. How did they pull that off? Is there an example where they pulled it off where they didn't actually have control of the state? Because we're not going to have control of the state here in America. That's my assumption. So is it possible to do that without having, say, in Wales, where they fund the production of Welsh language, TV shows? Can we do that ourselves?
I actually watched a documentary on the Estonians and how they did it. And like you said, there were people pushing the culture. It was an intentional community. They were intentionally keeping their community alive. And when you talk about, when it was illegal, towards the late stages of the USSR, it became normal to just break their laws. The Estonians, and they started doing things in the park, in public, and daring the Soviet troops, the Russians, to arrest them. And they wouldn't, because there were so many people around that would just stand in the way and say, no, this is our stuff. What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? So it took those activists, just a few key ones, keeping it alive so that when the dark time passed, it could flourish again, and it is.
So, and one other thing is that they worked to bring about the collapse of the Soviet political structure. Obviously, America had something to do with that. There were other geopolitical reasons why that happened, but they did push to end the Soviet Union, and eventually the Soviet Union did end, and that opened up the way for them to have their own country with their own culture. I think it's fair to say that we won't see the United States government in its current form endorse the full revitalization of our culture. There will have to be some breakaway that we push for. And
So in answer to your question, and it's related to that, I did read a paper by, I believe it was a Latvian author, sociologist, and he told about what they were doing and what they were trying to do during that time. And yes, they knew that they could go to prison or be sent to the gulags or whatever, but they started, they start recognizing festivals that were common to their people. They'd speak in their language. They would start having events and activities that focused and centered around their culture. So that's what we've got to do. So I'll dig up that paper and get it to you. To me, it's a very important paper.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that those historical examples are the best thing we have to go off of. However, I will also say I think that we should expect to settle in for the long haul of being under the power, under the state power that we're currently under. will we be able to maintain and promote a culture within this multicultural mess that America is? Is that a possibility? I think it is. But I guess, one of the things is it is a possibility as long as the state doesn't become, it limits the amount of authoritarianism that it does embrace, because there's a level of authoritarian control that the United States could get to that would make it really hard to maintain that culture and identity.
But an example of that, actually, from here in the United States, are the different tribes of the primitive people that were here. The government literally tried to destroy their tribes. They would not allow them to speak their language. They would not allow them to practice their religion. They forced them to go to Christian schools. They forced them to speak English. And they're recreating it now. They lived through, again, they made it through the hard times with a few key people who held on to that cultural knowledge. Now, how much of it was kept or lost, I don't know. I haven't really studied them closely. But I do know that they still at least try to keep to many of their original heritage ways.
Absolutely. And again, my experience when I lived in Canada, there was a time that the Canadian government wanted to erase French culture. And, my dad tells me that he wasn't allowed to speak French at school. And, they had to, the French used to wear wooden clogs. And then they had to start wearing regular shoes and things like that. What happened from that is in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a violent outbreak against the government. And then that was when the Canadian government started going with, bilingualism. So we're going to promote and accept both cultures. So on the one hand, I would argue, if they don't fear you, they're not going to respect you.
Well, and this is exactly what the Soviet Union did, and it served both as a way to, I think it's perestroika and one other.
Glasnost and perestroika.
Right. It served both as a way to liberalize the country to better compete with the United States, but also to give more freedom to the people on the edges of the empire who were getting very rowdy. And I mean, if we push for something like that, maybe by the end of our lifetimes we could see a big win like that.
Yeah, I think I don't want to get too deep into this one, but that does go to something we've all talked about, that this sort of black pill voting doesn't matter that you get on the right in America is just incorrect, because we do want our own glasnost and perestroika, right? We want libertarianism, sort of in a way, in America, in that we don't want the state to have enough authority that it can just stomp us, right? We want it to be hands-off enough that we're allowed to do our own cultural expressions. So I guess at some point we'll talk about...
And some of it is we have to not care whether we're allowed to do it or not. I mean, that's what you're seeing with the Latvians and the Estonians. They said, this is our culture and we have to sustain it. Nobody else is going to do it for us.
But it's way easier if you're allowed to.
Certainly.
So you do have to try to push to keep it acceptable by the state.
In fact, I would argue it might even be harder when things are freer.
That is actually a good point. Yeah.
When you're under pressure, Desmond Morris, anthropologist, used to argue humans are unified under stress and factious or divisional. They break apart when things are easy, and therefore, when things are at their toughest is when people bond together and sustain themselves. And even you hear about that. Jews say they're being loved to death, right? Because there's a lot of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and rightfully so, the Jewish elite don't want that for their own nation, their own people.
They certainly don't want it in Israel.
Right. And so sometimes when things are harder, it's easier to sustain a people. But I would argue, what do we have to do? We have to use every means that is available, that is legal, to advance the culture that we're talking about, Euramerican culture, the culture that continues on from the founding fathers, the colonists and settlers, to us. And we have to be promoting that because nobody else is going to promote that. We have the internet. We have podcasts like what we're doing. These are the means by which we can promote our culture.
Well, so I guess, I kind of want to start getting down that question. In terms of promoting our culture, there's artifacts of culture like we've talked about in terms of a video series or a little TV show, even if we got to the point where we could produce that, would be an amazing sort of cultural piece, right? That I think would promote, our identity and our culture. That's obviously a goal. And promoting music and promoting there's a number of cultural creation things, as well as going back and just replaying heritage cultural, stuff. But in terms of from a personal standpoint, thinking about what an individual can do, I guess, can we, real quick, can we kind of go over what would the sort of things be to do to try to embrace your Euramerican or European, North Americans, Europeans living in North America, the culture, the unique culture and identity that we have? How do we express that? How do we embrace that?
So the first thing gets back to, we said, the first thing about culture is who are we? So you've got to embrace and promote our identity as a unique people. The other thing is, we also talked about, is authority. So we have to reject the authority of people who don't embrace our culture and empower those that do embrace our culture. And that doesn't mean we have to be confrontational outside of our culture. But, everybody kind of, I've been around a lot of different cultures, and most cultures kind of have a wink and a nod as to knowing who's inside and who's outside. And yes, in many cases they have to follow the ruling foreign peoples, but wink and a nod, they know that their own culture is important. So identity and authority are the first two aspects of that.
Well, one thing you just reminded me of when we were talking about this, and Mr. Black, we've talked about this a lot, is language that you use and trying to shift your own language use and thoughts. Like one thing, whenever people talk about the United States and its horrible foreign policies over the last however many years, I really fight, and I'm pretty good now where I won't say we invaded Afghanistan. I'll say the United States invaded Afghanistan, because that wasn't me, that wasn't my culture, that wasn't my identity. My culture and identity are perfectly content to stay here. We don't want an empire.
Well, and to do even better, you could say the federal government invaded Afghanistan, because the name United States implies that the people who run our states are in favor of the policies that the federal government is taking.
But yeah, I think that's one thing individually that we can do, is work on it sounds semantic, but it's not, because working on the language you use affects the way you think. And
Absolutely.
So affecting that change in yourself by just working on it. And there's various ways to do that. Maybe we'll talk about on another event. But and there's whole groups that promote this online, which I think is great. I think that is one aspect that is very positive.
So the other thing is identify what's important and unique to our culture and promote it. So we have a unique history, so we should be telling our history. We have a unique musical approaches. We should be promoting that music. And I know that there are musical tastes and changes over time that, maybe what was popular in the 50s can't be popular now, for example. But you can make cultural aspects relevant by reframing it in today's kind of cultural norms.
Yeah, for me personally, part of my wife is very much into genealogy now. And it's been great because it's really solidified my my understanding of my family's history here. First of my line was born here in the 1630s. My wife just found another ancestor who was a captain on a ship during the Revolutionary War, another ancestor who served in the War of 1812. From my family, we were here from the founding. And, doing that's part of culture. I've started listening to a lot of obscure singers from the Appalachia and West Virginia and those areas, and they're still expressing pre-modern quote culture through their music, and they talk about their place in the world they're in the South, and they're still holding to that. So again, it's much like those guys in Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania singing their songs, not singing the Soviet song. They're going to sing their family's song. And that's part of how you go about doing that also.
Absolutely. And that's one thing, is that culture needs to be experienced. It needs to be conveyed or communicated to people. And therefore, we must I would argue, we must constantly be seeking to express aspects of our culture willfully, not just accidentally, but willfully, saying, this is an important aspect of our culture. I mean, one of the funniest things, that the left has done, Marxists, they come out about, the culture of white supremacy, and you read about, I actually wrote down some of the things they say, what are aspects of quote unquote white supremacy?
Being
and
on
they'd say,
time.
Mhm.
I love that one.
Wearing a suit.
Right, family-oriented, perfectionism, sense of urgency, quantity and quality, literature, paternalism. And I would argue and add also maternalism, because both we have to have a system for both. Systematic and logical thinking, and it's kind of funny. It's like, yeah, that's my culture.
Yeah, all the things that made America great, right there, a single list, real easy.
Now, there's another aspect so European culture actually had two layers, and this is something most people don't think about, but there was what's known as high culture, and there was folk culture. So the high culture was the unifying kind of leadership culture across all of the European peoples, and there was folk culture. So I would argue we need to know both, because the way we're going to unify our people is by having a high culture, which is familiar with business and organizational principles and ability to write and literature. But then there's also the folk culture underlying that we should become familiar with. And in America, there was a folk culture. We were being taught in schools American folk culture up until the mid-'70s. So, there was an attempt to have unique American dance and dress, for example, and you still see some of that out of Texas, where the frilly dresses and the cowboy hats with certain kind of shirts and stuff, that's American culture.
I would say, at least from my experience here in the Southwest, even into the 80s, we were doing that. We would get together, and for music class, we would sing Old Susanna, and we would sing a lot of the older things that you could just do a cappella as a class. And, these were songs that came from the 1800s, and we were still singing them. But that is, now when my kids went, that's completely gone. It's been wiped away.
When I was in first grade, we did maypole dances and things like that. So it's our responsibility to make that stuff sustain itself and carry it forward. No one's going to do it for us. So.
Well, I think there's so much more to go over, honestly.
Yeah, I would love to say we could encapsulate this all into one show, but there's no way to do that.
I mean, we could do like another hour, I think, now, but I think we'll kind of wrap it up. I think that answers the core question here. I think maybe the next time we talk, we can talk about more specifics of cultural artifacts. One thing I'm kind of mulling over that I want to talk about, but that's just way too big, is what aspects of current American culture, or at what point of American culture, how much of that can we embrace? How much of that can we make our own? How much of that has gotten too subverted or too taken over? Yeah, I don't know. And just kind of thinking about what makes a cultural element foreign, what makes it ours. There's a lot there, and I think this is actually really important because we want to know, we have to be able to think about this stuff in order to know what we're promoting and know what we're taking on for ourselves.
Just a quick thought on that. I would say that Americans want their culture back.
But they don't know what that means.
Right, except the new Top Gun movie. It is a love letter to the 1980s,
Agreed.
and it has now become the most popular movie in history, I believe.
Right, and so the question is, can we just embrace the 80s? I don't think we can.
No.
But
Maybe a little bit.
But
a
that
little
shows
bit,
the
yeah.
desire that people know there's something else that we want.
yeah.
It's not this stuff that's being pushed today.
Yeah, but okay, that's a good point. And obviously, people in America are unhappy. Not just white people, not just Euramerican. Everyone is not happy with how America is going. They all know that something is wrong. That's an opportunity, obviously, for us to move in there and recreate our culture and our identity and our people again. So I think that longing for the 80s that I see a lot of. And you see it just in the fact that our music has become a recreation of the 80s.
Even my kids they love 80s music. They hate today's music. They love 80s movies. They hate today's movies.
There are so many movies now that come out that are basically just 80s movies, right? They're 80s themed. They're 80s, they're just a little more degenerate now than they were back then. But yeah, that sign right there, that longing for 40 years ago, that's a sign that things are not going super well in the country. And that's our cue, right? That's why, honestly, that's why I'm here. Is if everything had been going swimmingly in America, I probably would never have activated. So yeah, that's another good point.
So I'd like to add and answer one question. So how can the listeners move forward and embrace their own culture? And we've already said culture starts with identity and authority. And that was some of the things that I had tried to put together in the ENA resolution. So it is a statement of identity. I am a Euro-American. I accept that. That's who I am. I would like to be able to say American, but that term's been stolen from us. So Euro-American clearly defines what we're talking about. And then accept the authority of people who embrace that and the ideas that are supportive of that as the second step. So first is identity, two is authority, and then dedicate some time of your life to researching your culture and helping other people understand it. That's what I would argue.
With that, I think that's probably the best ending for this show that we could come up with.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we're just getting started on this podcast. Really, at this point, I know we've been working at it for a while, and I feel like there's so much more to talk about because we have these conversations on our own, not on microphone, not being recorded fairly regularly. But I think it's really good to have like a topic and sit down. It's good for all of us, and I hope that you all get something from it too. So this is Mr. R signing off. Do you all want to?
Mr. Ed signing off.
See ya.
Mr. Black's out of here.
And talk to you in a month.
Bye.